What if I told you that some of the most famous psychology experiments went horribly wrong? And not in the fun, oops kind of way, but more in the, let's traumatize people for science kind of way. Welcome to the world of psychology experiments that took a very dark turn. The Milgram Experiment. All right, let's kick things off with one of the most infamous psychology experiments of all time, the Milgram Experiment. If you've ever wondered how far people would go when they're just following orders, this one's got the answers. And let's just say they're not pretty. Picture this. You walk into a lab and a guy in a white coat tells you, hey, we're just running a little study on learning and punishment. Don't worry, it's nothing too crazy. You just have to press this button. Simple enough, right? Well, not quite, because when you press that button, the person on the other end, who you think is a fellow participant, starts screaming. They're begging for you to stop, telling you they have a heart condition. But the guy in the lab coat, he calmly says, the experiment must go on. Please continue. What would you do? Most of us like to think that we'd say, no way, dude, I'm out of here. But Milgram's experiment showed that a shocking, pun intended, 65% of people kept pressing the button, delivering what they thought were lethal electric shocks. Why? Because some authority figure in a white coat told them to. Yeah, it turns out I was just following orders isn't just an excuse. It's wired into us. Now, Milgram set out to understand if regular people would obey authority even if it meant hurting someone else. And spoiler alert, they would. And did. Over and over again. But let's take a look behind the scenes. The victim wasn't actually being shocked. They were just actors, really good ones apparently. But the person pressing the button didn't know that, and all that emotional toll was real. People were sweating, shaking, some even had breakdowns, all because the guy in the white coat said, keep going. Imagine being in that position and thinking, wait, am I the bad guy here? You're just there to participate in a science experiment, and now you're in a moral crisis, wondering if you're about to send someone to an early grave, all for a study on learning? Yeah, probably not what you signed up for. The real question is, what did we learn from this? Well, apart from the fact that humans can be a bit too obedient for their own good, Milgram's experiment revealed just how powerful authority figures can be.
Respect my authority!
It raised all kinds of ethical concerns, though. I mean, tricking people into thinking they're torturing someone, not exactly a feel-good moment for science. Psychologists today look back at the Milgram experiment with mixed awe and horror. On one hand, it provided groundbreaking insights into human behavior. On the other hand, it probably sent a few people to therapy. And let's not forget, this was in the 1960s, before ethics committees really cracked down on the whole don't traumatize your patients thing. At the end of the day, the Milgram's experiment taught us something truly unsettling. Give a person a button and a little encouragement, and they just might turn into a monster. But hey, at least the participants didn't get electrocuted themselves. Small victories, right? And while the experiment was groundbreaking, it wasn't without its critics. Many argue that Milgram pushed subjects too far, emotionally scarring them in the name of research. Some even say the results might have been different if the participants weren't under so much pressure to obey. But one thing's for sure, the Milgram experiment proved that humans are more susceptible to authority than we'd like to admit. And that's pretty terrifying. The Stanford Prison Experiment. Next up, we have the infamous Stanford Prison Experiment, where a bunch of college students got way into their roles as prison guards and prisoners. What started as a, let's see what happens when we put a bunch of people in a mock prison, turned into, a full-blown nightmare. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo decided to create a simulated prison environment in the basement of Stanford University. The plan was simple. Recruit 24 male college students and randomly assign them to either be prisoners or guards. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks, but things got out of hand in just 6 days. Turns out when you give ordinary people power over others, things go south pretty quickly. The guards, given uniforms, sunglasses, and a shiny baton, suddenly transformed into mini dictators. Some of them started to harass and psychologically abuse the prisoners, forcing them to perform degrading tasks like cleaning toilets with their bare hands. The prisoners? Well, they didn't fare much better. Within days, they were showing signs of severe emotional distress, with some even having mental breakdowns. And remember, this was all just pretend, but for these students, it became all too real, all too fast. Imagine signing up for a study thinking you'll just hang out, maybe write a paper later, and then suddenly you're trapped in a basement wearing a smelly jumpsuit, being yelled at by your classmate who's taking his guard role a little too seriously. Not exactly what you'd expect for some extra credit. One of the most disturbing parts of the experiment is how quickly people adapted to their roles. The guards became increasingly cruel and the prisoners increasingly submissive. It got so bad that one prisoner, after being locked in solitary confinement, began screaming uncontrollably and had to be removed from the study entirely. And Zimbardo? He just stood by and watched. In fact, he even played the role of prison superintendent, which probably wasn't the best idea in hindsight. So what did we learn from this chaotic mess of an experiment? Zimbardo's big takeaway was the concept of the power of the situation. He believed that it wasn't the students were inherently evil or weak, but rather that the environment they were placed in, where the guards had absolute power and the prisoners were utterly powerless, turned them into their worst selves. It was a stark reminder of how easily power can corrupt, even in a pretend setting. It's kind of like that one friend who gets way too into Monopoly and starts flipping the board over when they're losing. Power does weird things to people. The Stanford Prison Experiment is still one of the most controversial studies in psychology. Critics argue that Zimbardo acted irresponsibly by letting the abuse escalate, and some even question whether the experiment was ethically sound to begin with. After all, the participants weren't exactly prepared for the psychological trauma they'd endure. What was supposed to be a harmless study on human behavior turned into something much different. And like the Milgram Experiment, the Stanford Prison Experiment raised a lot of red flags about the ethics in psychological research. Today, there are strict rules in place to protect participants from this kind of mental and emotional harm. So don't worry, you won't get stuck in a fake prison cell anytime soon. But it's safe to say that this type of experiment left a lasting scar on both the participants and the field of psychology as a whole.
The Little Albert Experiment.
Now let's talk about one of the most disturbing experiments in psychology that involved an unsuspecting baby. Sounds fun, right? Well, not for little Albert, the poor infant who became the subject of an experiment that would never fly today. In 1920, psychologist John Watson wanted to prove that fear could be conditioned into humans, and his brilliant idea, scaring a baby to see what happens. Yeah, someone actually thought this was a good idea. So here's how it went down. Little Albert, an adorable, healthy 9-month-old baby, was placed in a room with a bunch of fluffy animals. At first, Albert was happy. No fear, just curiosity. But then Watson and his colleague decided to take things up a notch. Every time Albert reached for a cute, fluffy white rat, they banged a loud steel bar behind his head, scaring the living daylights out of him. After repeating this enough times, Albert started to associate the rat with the terrifying noise. Eventually, just the sight of the rat, or anything furry really, sent him into a fit of terror. So the next time you feel bad about having a weird phobia, just remember at least no one intentionally traumatized you for science. Poor Albert wasn't just scared of rats by the end of the experiment, he started fearing anything remotely similar. Rabbits, dogs, even a guy in a Santa Claus mask. And all this fear conditioning was done for one reason, to prove a point that fear could be learned. Mission accomplished, I guess. But here's where things get really dark. After the experiment, Watson and his colleagues didn't even try to uncondition little Albert. They just left him with his irrational fear of anything fluffy. To make matters worse, there's no record of what happened to Albert after the experiment. For all we know, he could have spent his whole life terrified of anything that even slightly resembled a rat. Talk about being scared for your life. Imagine running out of the room every time someone pulls out a teddy bear. Today, the Little Albert Experiment stands as one of the most unethical studies in psychology history. It's a stark reminder of the consequences of treating human subjects, especially babies, like lab rats. Thankfully, modern ethics has come a long way since then, and traumatizing infants for the sake of science is definitely off the table now.
Ooh, one of my favorites, the monster study.
If you think scaring babies is bad, wait until you hear about the monster study, an experiment that messed with kids' speech development and left them scarred for life. It sounds like a plot from a horror movie, but sadly this was all too real. In 1939, psychologist Wendell Johnson and his graduate student Mary Tudor at the University of Iowa wanted to study the origins of stuttering. They believed that labeling a child as a stutterer could actually cause them to develop a speech impediment. And guess what? They decided to test this theory on 22 orphan children. Yes, you heard that right. Orphans. Who better to mess with than kids who already had a rough start in life? The researchers divided the children into two groups. The first group, made up of kids with normal speech, was given positive reinforcement. They were told how great their speech was and everything seemed fine. But the second group, also made up of normally speaking kids, was told the opposite. The researchers labeled those children as stutterers and criticized their every word, even when they spoke perfectly. The result? These kids started developing speech problems that stuck with them for years, some of them the rest of their lives. Talk about giving kids a complex. Imagine being told over and over again that you're terrible at something you were perfectly fine at. And then one day, you actually start believing it. Welcome to the monster study. The worst part? The kids in the negative group weren't even told that they were part of an experiment. They had no idea they were being manipulated, and no one intervened to help them. The psychological damage was real, and many of the children struggled with self-esteem and speech issues well into adulthood. So if you've ever had stage fright or stuttered in front of a crowd, just be glad you didn't grow up in a psychology lab in the 1930s. This unethical study remained hidden for decades, only coming to light in the early 2000s. The University of Iowa eventually issued an apology to the surviving participants, acknowledging the harm done. But for those kids, the damage was already done. The monster study remains one of the most shameful moments in the history of psychological research, a chilling reminder that not all experiments are worth the cost.
Get your tinfoil hats out, because we're adding MKUltra to the list.
Now, if you thought the other experiments were unsettling, hold on tight, because MKUltra takes things to a whole new level. Imagine the CIA conducting secret mind control experiments, dosing people with LSD, and trying to erase memories, all in the name of national security. Sounds like a conspiracy theory, right? But no, it's real. Welcome to one of the darkest darkest chapters in American history. Back in the 1950s, at the height of the Cold War paranoia, the CIA was convinced that mind control was the next big weapon. So in a typical spy agency fashion, they launched Project MKUltra to see if they could manipulate people's minds, essentially creating a Manchurian candidate. And how did they go about that? By secretly dosing unwitting civilians, prisoners, and even their own employees with LSD and other drugs. Yep, they were running full-blown human experiments without anyone's consent. Because who needs ethics when you're trying to create a mind-controlled super soldier, right? Imagine going to a party thinking you're just having a drink, and the next thing you know, the CIA secretly spiked your punch with acid. Welcome to MKUltra. The idea was to see if drugs like LSD could be used to break down someone's psyche and make them more susceptible to suggestion. But the experiments didn't stop at just drugs. They also used hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and even electroshock therapy to try and manipulate people's minds. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. But that didn't stop the CIA from ruining countless lives in the process. One of the most tragic stories from MKUltra is that of Frank Olson, a CIA employee who was unknowingly dosed with LSD by his superiors. Shortly after, Olson began suffering from severe paranoia and depression, eventually falling, or possibly being pushed, from a 13th floor window to his death. The official story was suicide, but many believe that Olson was silenced because he knew too much about the darker side of MKUltra. Either way, his death remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire program. So if you've ever had a bad trip, just be thankful it wasn't courtesy of the CIA. MKUltra wasn't officially exposed until the 1970s, when the US government finally admitted that, yeah, dosing people with acid without their consent probably wasn't the best idea. By then, the damage had already been done. Many of the people who were experimented on, often without knowing it, were left with lifelong psychological trauma. And because the CIA conveniently destroyed most of the documents related to the project, we'll probably never know the full extent of what went down. The fallout from MKUltra was so intense that it led to major reforms in how the US government conducts research on human subjects. Today there are strict guidelines in place to prevent this kind of abuse. But the fact that this happened at all still sends chills down people's spines. I mean, it's one thing to have a bad day at work, but imagine finding out that your boss was secretly using you as a lab rat for a mind control experiment. That's a whole new level of a bad day. MKUltra is often cited as one of the most unethical and inhumane programs ever carried out by the US government. It was a nightmarish blend of psychological manipulation and human experimentation, and outright cruelty. So the next time you hear someone talking about conspiracy theories, just remember, sometimes the truth is stranger and more terrifying than fiction. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the darker side of psychology, be sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Thanks for watching.